Hi, everybody. So Matt says, I've got to smile more. Smile more and laugh less. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Deborah. Hi, Kay. And hi, Matt. Okay, thank you for sharing. And thank you for coming. I think we'll wait for just a minute until we get a few more here. Hi, Joanne. How are you? Nice to see you. Matt says all is well with the world when Joe smiles. I wouldn't say that. I would certainly wish that were the case, folks. Hi, Evelina. How are you? Nice to see you. Well, sharing is going very well. Now, please keep it up as we go forward. I need a lot of shares tonight. And punch that like button. Okay, tonight is a Q&A night. I thought it might be time for another Q&A night because all kinds of things are happening. And Stephanie Kelton's book was also Smile When Your Heart is Aching. And Stephanie Kelton's book was released, and she also had an opinion piece in the New York Times today. And that was, the title of her opinion piece was Why I'm Not Worried About America's $1 trillion Deficits. And there's a link at the bottom to her book, The Deficit Myth, which I've begun to read already. I had pre-ordered it, and it was not released until today. I actually got the book late last night. I got an email message saying it was available on Kindle. And so I quickly went there and got a hold of the book and read a part of the introduction before I went to sleep. I was not surprised to find that I had read some of the introduction before, because she'd certainly been talking about it for some time now. A column that appeared in the Times today, in the opinion piece, was adapted from the book. And if I can manage this all in a proper way here. I'll give you a glimpse of the cover of the book momentarily, if you have not already seen it. Just share the screen here. And I'll share the screen with the cover. And there it is. You should be seeing it without too much difficulty, I hope. That's Uncle Sam, who's pulling out his pockets and finding that they're empty. But we know, of course, that they're not empty at all, right? They're only empty if the government chooses to leave them empty. The Congress, in particular, chooses to leave them empty. We hope that's not going to happen for very much of the time. And Russ says he received the notice that his Kindle version came through today. And yes, mine came through, but also today at roughly, I guess I got my message at about 12:30 or something like that, and downloaded the book soon after. Kay says she loves the cover pick, and Matt says, Joe, the ideology of capitalism was that individuals pursuing their own self-interest to own a competitive market produce the best for society. We now live in the age of super monopolies. What is the next stage, of capitalism? Well, if we live in the age of super monopolies and there's no competitive market, then it doesn't follow from the ideology, of capitalism that the super monopolies pursuing their own self-interest will produce the best for society, because since they're super monopolies, they're not living in a competitive market. So the next stage, of capitalism depends on what we in the political system decide to do. We could roll back the evolution of capitalism, break up all the super monopolies. We could, if we wanted to, make things highly competitive again and then see what happens. Or we could reason, I suppose, that, well, if we're living in the age of the super monopolies, or any monopolies at all, then obviously we don't have a competitive marketplace. So there's no longer any justification for laissez-faire. So therefore, what we really ought to do is to regulate the monopolies and the super monopolies as we please, or even get rid of them entirely by taking them over and owning them as a society, but collectively, and that what we really ought to do is to do what works best for the people, to do what's best for the public purpose as determined by the people. Maybe that's the next stage of capitalism, and maybe the next stage of socialism, and maybe the next stage of everything is doing things what's best for public purpose, as determined by what the people think the public purpose is. I hope that's it. I hope that's it. I don't know what to call that. Maybe we ought to call it democracy. Let's have some economic democracy, or political economic democracy. Maybe we ought to call that democratism. Say we prefer democratism to capitalism or socialism or any other kind of ism. Hey, what about that? Why don't we try that for a while? Lana says, hi all, please share this live stream to your page. Please share the live stream to your page. That's very effective. and share it with a few words, a few choice words. So today was another very eventful day. Lots of criticism of the Republican stance of waiting at least until sometime in July to consider what the fourth phase of relief will be for the economy. And there's a lot of heavy criticism coming down the pike for the Republican stance on this and for Mitch McConnell. There's also news that Amy McGrath is now facing a much stiffer challenger in the Kentucky primary from Charles Booker, who looks like a wonderful Bernie-crat type of candidate who might be able to beat Mitch. He speaks very well. He's a very attractive guy. Gives an impression of being a very strong personality. Hopefully he can beat Amy and then move on to beat the pants off old Froggy, Senator McConnell. And that's it. Does anyone know the status of the Tlaib Rohan Gray plan? A Gray in this case is spelled Grey in Rohan Gray. And that for the $1 trillion coin. Well, it's not a plan for the $1 trillion coin. It's a plan for $2,000 a month for everyone in the United States, as long as the crisis lasts, and then for 1 year thereafter, $1,000 a month for everybody in the United States, or at least all the adults in the United States. While the crisis is going on, $1,000 a month for each child as well. And I forget whether it's $500 a month for each child after the crisis is over, for 1 year after the crisis. But anyway, that's what those are the main provisions of the bill. Of course, there is a provision of how to pay for it. They thought it was necessary to put that in. And so they took the opportunity to say, we're going to pay for it with $1 trillion coins, with $2 trillion coins. And that was explained in the bill and is a part of the act, okay, the proposed act. So the question is whether the act will ever get a floor vote. Now, right now, it's not scheduled to get a floor vote. It's not part of the HEROES Act because Nancy Pelosi chose not to build it into the HEROES Act. There are many Democratic groups now advocating for the HEROES Act, in spite of the fact that it bails out most of the lobbyists in D.C. That is a very, very unfortunate thing. But anyway, that's the status. And Lana says, I like Booker, sent him a few dollars. And Kay says, Booker is excellent. He is excellent. Rick Maynard says, 30 Dems, not all of them blue dogs, sign a letter warning the debt is getting too high, recommending a commission to deal with Social Security and Medicare. And if you follow the references, invoking the spirit of Simpson Bowles. Not good. Scott Peters, House.gov. Oh, yes. I think also Sheldon Whitehouse was in back of such a bill as well some time ago. But I think what's in that bill is going to be impacted by Stephanie's book, which I'm sure the publisher is going to promote the hell out of that. They've actually been doing it for years, Kate, already, and it's finally hit. And of course, it's going to be touted by Bernie Sanders and a bunch of other Bernie-crats. So it's probably going to sell a lot, which means the publisher is going to push it even further, and the book is probably going to get a lot of discussion. In fact, some of the ideas were receiving discussion Times today based on the opinion piece that Stephanie put in the Times. As of this moment, there were 780 comments that the opinion piece had thus far. Let me see. I'll refresh it and see if it's more than 780 comments now. 819 comments already. Susan Eldridge has seen some of those comments and has said they obviously haven't read the piece and they don't know anything about MMT. Well, none of that is surprising to us. Of course, none of it is surprising. Matt said, is anyone from the Progressive Caucus supporting Shahed Buttar? I don't know. The best thing to do is go on his site and see whether he's been endorsed by Rashida or maybe Ilhan. They'll have the guts to endorse him, I'm sure. But of course, if anybody endorses Shahed, they're going to get some pushback from Nancy Pelosi, probably, who will glare at them. And Rick says, nature calls God. Thank you, Rick. We needed to know that. It just got off 2 Zoom meetings. Thank you. We'll expect you back shortly. Joanne says, I only like MMT progressives. Thank you, Joanne. Jeff says, I got it last night, a hard copy on the way. Why do you need a hard copy, Jeff? Why do you need a hard copy? I can get along without hard copies these days. Anyway, I have a Kindle copy. I don't have a hard copy. And Russ says, oh, I'm sure the neoclassical PhDs are shitting their pants with inflation and Weimar in the comments and loaded with straw men. Probably. They're probably going ape in the comments. Well, we will reply in kind. If you remember, we gave Paul Krugman on various occasions a very, very tough time when he went into that sort of dance. I think over the years he changed his tune a little bit. Jeff said, I can't stand reading long electronic. No. I always think it's very convenient to be able to make the type as large as I want to and to be able to scroll down. Jeff says, I got the Kindle copy to support Stephanie and to tide me over until the hard copy arrives. I'm happy with the Kindle copy, I think. Maybe she'll send me a desk copy, the hard copy. Evelina says, can you comment on what might be going on with respect to corporations dipping into the Federal Reserve while Americans are undergoing the worst health and economic crisis? I'm not sure what you mean by dipping into the Federal Reserve. The large corporations got a $4.6 trillion slush fund established at the Federal Reserve, supposedly to bail them out through loans that would be made to them by the Fed. Of course, those loans were intended to be very low interest loans, and I'm sure they will be very low interest loans, probably very close to zero. But they will have to give that money back to the Fed. Now, some of the large corporations have been dipping into the funds that were set aside for loans to small businesses, and the publicity got some of them to give back those loans, but others did not. I don't know exactly how many billions were lent to large corporations that were using technicalities to claim that their subsidiaries were small corporations. And so they went for the PPP program and tried to get a piece of the PPP program. There are other things, going on too. In the new HEROES Act, there's a bailout for lobbyists who are usually funded by the large corporations. So basically, if the lobbyists get funded by the federal government instead, then large corporations won't have to make as large contributions to them this year as they normally do. So that may be another way in which the large corporations are dipping into things. Kate says, here's my latest show on absentee voting specifically for New Hampshire. I'm sorry, Rick says this. Here's my latest show on absentee voting for New Hampshire, but applies elsewhere if done quickly. And that's a YouTube video from Rick, so of course we recommend that. Matt says, Joe, do you know anything about the Fed actually buying the bonds of the municipalities? How exactly does that work? There was to be a muni bond program that I thought was funded in part in the CARES Act, but at a fairly low level. I think the Fed was trying to set up a muni bond facility that it would use to buy municipal bonds, which essentially means to lend money to the municipalities. And so that's the way that was going to work. It may be, I'm not sure about this, but it may be that some of the funds that were intended for cities were placed at the Fed to cover any possible losses of the Fed, and then the Fed was to establish a loan facility for that. My memory is a little hazy, but I read somewhere that there has been a bond facility, set up by the Federal Reserve for the cities to use, but it hasn't been too active as yet. But the cities have been expecting, and states have been accepting, a rather large bailout. That was to be part of the HEROES Act. There was $1 trillion in the HEROES Act for states and for the municipalities and other cities, and I think also counties. But that hasn't gotten off the ground yet. But probably, even if the Republicans don't do anything right now, by the time they get back in July, there's going to be an overwhelming amount of pressure to do things for the states, and for the local areas, so that they don't have to lay off a whole bunch of people and ruin the economy, because there could be millions more people that would be laid off by the states and by local governments has happened in the recession of 2009, 2010, unless they get that $1 trillion worth of help. And maybe that $1 trillion is not even going to be enough to head off things, but it would be a start. So that's probably one thing that will come out of the dickering that's going to take place either later this month or in July sometime. I think the states and the cities are probably going to get some aid, but what will happen is that individuals will be left out in the cold. There may be no further expanded unemployment insurance payments made. There may be no basic income payments that come out of it. There may be no job guarantee that comes out of it. Uh, it's hard to know, but there's going to be a lot more dickering in Congress because probably more of Congress will be back. And I don't think Nancy Pelosi is going to be quite so dominant this summer as she was in April and in May when she was working there virtually alone in the Congress, essentially dictating the structure of the HEROES Act. And the progressives didn't have very much say in it at all. Kay says, voting in Georgia was a hell of a mess today. Yes, I've been seeing news of that it was a hell of a mess, that they probably deliberately set up lots of primary voting machines which weren't working in black areas, of course, so as to try to further disenfranchise blacks, in Georgia. I mean, Brian Kemp is just such scum. What a swine that guy is. Steve asks, any results on the Paula Jean election, in West Virginia, hoping for an upset. I'm hoping for an upset there, too. I don't have any news of that as yet. Let's see what we get from, if there's been any late news carried by Common Dreams. On primary results. Okay, the top line article there is the troubles in the Georgia primary. The primary was plagued by long lines and voting machine problems, and the people aren't social distancing. Some of them have masks. A lot of them are going to the primary without any masks, and as I say, without very much in the way of social distancing based on the photo that I'm seeing there. Now, when we look at the COVID tracker for the United States, we see that Georgia has 2,285 fatalities out of 53,000 cases. Not the worst performance in the United States by far, but, it's a fairly warm state, in Georgia. They should be doing great there. But the Georgia population Georgia population is estimated at 10.7 million. So Georgia has 213 deaths per million, lower than the average for the United States, but not exactly a sterling performance, okay, by any means. Okay, today, I was looking at various levels of performance in relation to the coronavirus. And it seems to me the best performing state, okay, in the United States at this point, off the top of my head, looked like it was Hawaii. Let me see if I can find it for you quickly here. It has 1.4 million people, and it had only 17 fatalities, which works out to about 12 fatalities per million for Hawaii. For Georgia, it's 213 fatalities per million. Now, that's nowhere near New York State, is it? Okay, certainly not a New York State type, okay, situation, but certainly not a good performance either. And certainly no justification for people prancing around in Georgia without any masks and without social distancing. A bad thing to do, it seems to me. Kay says she hasn't heard anything about the totals yet in West Virginia. Jeff says, can you walk through the basic accounting of a bond purchase, then transfer, then the redemption? Just a rough overview, no T-charts or anything. I'm trying to understand how money moves between the non-government sector, the Fed. Well, bond purchase, then transfer. Jeff, I'm not sure what you mean by transfer. If you're talking about a private sector actor buying a Treasury bond, okay, I think that what happens is that there's some kind, okay, of mechanism by which but the actor can indicate that it's buying a bond worth a certain amount of dollars under the aegis of an offer from the Treasury, and it has to pay for that particular bond. I suppose at present it pays for that bond through a wire transfer. Now, standing in between the wire transfer, of course, is the banking agent of the Treasury, which is the Fed. And what the Fed does when such a wire comes in is that it takes the money out of the account, okay, of the purchaser, exactly in the same way as it takes tax money when taxes are paid. Then, so essentially, it marks down the reserve account of the bank of the buyer. Then the bank of the buyer marks down the checking account, the checking account of the buyer, and then the Fed will mark up the Treasury spending account of the Treasury Department for the amount of the bond sale. And I think that's it at that point. Now, the way the redemption happens is that there's a date before the maturity of the bond. And at that point, the Treasury has to send a wire but to the bond holder for the amount of the principal and for the amount of interest that is due on the bond. And so at that point, the Fed will mark down the Treasury spending account for the amount of the principal of the bond and for the interest, which is due on that bond. Then it will mark up the reserves of the bondholder, by that amount, who in turn will mark up the checking account of the purchaser of the bond for both the principal and the interest. I think that's the way it happens. I don't think it's different from tax accounting in that way and from federal spending in that way. When the Treasury wants to spend for something, I think the kind of thing that's done by these days is that in response to a bill, or in response to some record, of what it owes, it wire transfers the money to the payee. And the wire goes through the Fed system. And so the Fed will mark up the reserve account of the bank of the payee, and then the bank of the payee will mark up the checking account of the payee with the amount of the principal and the amount of the interest that's due to the payee. It's just a normal banking procedure at the Fed level. I don't think it's any different than what you understand right at this point in terms of ordinary taxes and spending, Jeff. The way I understand it is that the bond holder has a bond account, and that these wires, I've been talking about, simply mean that the bond account is a record of what the Treasury owes to the bondholder. And when the time comes, and the bondholder is paid, the bond account is marked down by the amount of the bond, and the checking account of the bondholder is marked up by the amount of the principal of the bond and the interest that is due on the bond. And Jeff then asks how the money bounces between each institution sector upon purchase, transfer, and then by redemption. If this is too broad a question, then just pick your own favorite piece. I don't think it's too broad a question, but I guess I'm puzzled why you would ask the question, since you already understand what happens when the federal government spends money into the private sector, and also what happens when the private sector sends its taxes to the Treasury Department. Since you understand the mechanisms in both of those cases, why wouldn't you understand the purchase process, okay, and then the redemption process? As for the transfer process, I'm not sure what you mean by the transfer process. As I understand it, it's the bondholder's bank, the buyer's bank, and the seller's bank, the Fed, that are interacting. And what's happening is that the bank account of the buyer is marked down when they purchase. Okay. And then the bank of the buyer gets marked down by the Federal Reserve for the amount of the purchase. Okay. And then the bond account of the buyer is marked up with the principal of the bond that is purchased. And once all this is done, then the Fed will mark up the Treasury spending account for the amount of the principal. And what happens with respect to the redemption, is simply the reverse. So what's still troubling you, Jeff? Kay says, Stacey Abrams, yes, there is a spelling error. It's Abrams. Should have been home in Georgia today. Most probably, I think she would be in Georgia today. Hopefully, she's sheltering in place. Steve says, what do you think of a public bank for a city like Los Angeles? We tried to get one going. I thought you were succeeding in getting a public bank going for Los Angeles, Steve. I'd be very disappointed if you don't succeed, in getting it going. I thought it was just about a done deal by now. Anyway, I think it's a great idea for the city, of Los Angeles. And basically what you need is a unit of government that is large enough, involves enough people and enough financial transactions to be able to constitute, a public bank. City of Los Angeles is certainly large enough to do that. It has a pension fund that's large enough to back it. So if what's followed is something like the model, okay, of North Dakota, the core of the bank, its ability to get started, would be based on the pension funds being used to start off the bank. And I would expect that would happen, okay, in Los Angeles. And after that, it would act very much like the Bank, okay, of North Dakota banks, basically making commercial loans, being able to draw on the Federal Reserve System, okay, in some way. Lana has sent a few dollars to Shahid too. That's great, Lana. Travis Daigle says, metal technology company president charged in a scheme to defraud investors and healthcare benefit programs in connection with COVID-19 testing. Well, I'm sure that's not the last such scandal. That there's going to be a lot of that going on. Thank you for the link, Travis. Kay says, I like that idea, Steve. Needed everywhere, in my opinion. Yeah, I think it's needed for every major city and every state to have a public bank. We should have a network of public banks in this country and a network of post office banks also, which of course would be public banks in their own right, though their functions might be more restricted in terms of dealing with the commercial world than the public banks of the states and the localities would be. Travis Daigle points out that this is released by the DOJ. Sandy Degg says, hello. Hello, Sandy. Where you been? And very glad to see you. And Travis says, still believe those COVID numbers? Is that a question? No, I don't believe the COVID numbers. I think they're underestimated across the board. Okay, but I think the best numbers are the fatality numbers. But those are distorted too, because in many states they're probably attributing fatalities that should not be attributed to COVID. But I also think that as time goes on, we will be able to measure through indirect means what the actual fatalities due to COVID were likely to have been, because we'll compare fatality rates from last year with respect to all various other diseases, and we'll see whether there's a sudden spike in those fatalities this year, and we'll be able to reasonably attribute any sudden spikes to COVID and subtract from the other totals and add to the COVID totals to come up with a better estimate of what is going on. Kay says, hey, Sandy. And Matt said, do you know how Shahid is polling? No, I don't know that there have been any polls in Nancy Pelosi's district. I haven't seen any. I think that's the California 12th, if I'm not mistaken. Travis says no second wave is coming. No second wave of COVID? No, I think it's coming. Travis says, but another event is wake up. What's the other event that you see, Travis? And Lana says, how did the Chinese get to the U.S. to buy treasuries? Is it only via imports? Well, okay, Chinese people get the currency. China gets our dollars. through selling imports here. Okay, so it gets a trade surplus, okay, in that way. And the trade surplus gives it essentially dollar reserves. Now, as far as China buying treasuries, I think the Chinese, just like anybody else, are free to bid in our treasury auctions. And that's how they get to buy treasuries. Or am I misunderstanding your question? It's an odd way to put it. How do the Chinese get the U.S. to buy treasuries? I think you mean, how does the U.S. get China to buy our treasuries? I think that's what you're asking, but I'm not entirely sure. So you'll clarify for me. Jeff Epstein says, by transfer, I mean selling it to someone else. Oh, like China selling $1 billion of their treasuries to Japan. China goes down $1 billion, and Japan goes up by $1 billion. I think what happens there is that that basically Japan pays China somehow in some currency for the treasuries. They don't have to pay in dollars for the treasuries if they want to, and if China wants the Japanese currency, okay, then China could sell them in return for yen, okay, or some other third-party currency. Depends on what China wants to sell them for. But the Chinese account at the Fed would then be marked down. Okay, the bond account at the Fed would be marked down, and it would be marked down by the $1 billion. And in turn, the Japanese bond account would be marked up by the Fed in the amount of $1 billion. That's all that would happen. It's just simply marking up and marking down accounts. Okay, if that's what you mean by transfer. I wasn't clear that you were thinking of a sale situation. Evelina says, not a wave, a tsunami. You bet that will wake people up in more wars than one. Yeah. Evelina says, waves, not wars. Well, you could have meant wars. And Russ says, Nathan Tankis probably has the balance sheet by plumbing mapped out on the flow of bonds. Yeah, Nathan's probably done that. Or maybe Scott has done that. But Fullweiler, that is, of course. And Kay says, still 85 outside here, way too hot. Yeah, it's similar here, too. It was something like 93 to 94 here today, and it felt like it was 104 or 105. And we were out. We were out. We needed some cash, so we went to the bank today. And then we did a few other things. And then we came home. Thanks, Jeff said. That helps. We'll listen again. I'm closer than I thought. I'm just missing a few details. Yes. Okay, I think you are closer. And Steve says, in general, is our bond market doing well at the moment? Asking for my 401k. Okay, are you talking about treasuries, U.S. treasuries? I think they are in tremendous demand at present, as they have been for many years now. That they are still something that other countries flee to. Sandy says, I'm here, Joe, sharing and listening to the best live stream on Facebook. Thank you, Sandy. Now that one makes me smile, certainly. Joanne says, I have an IRA, and it is not bad. I haven't lost much. God. Oh, Joanne says, COVID numbers are rising in Phoenix since the reopening. Yeah, I was looking at a graphic today, okay, on states where the cases were rising. I forget where I picked that up from, but the fastest percentage rise in cases in the United States was going on in two states. One was in Arizona, and one was in Massachusetts. The other was, okay, in Massachusetts. But fatalities per million, okay, in Arizona was still not very high yet compared to other states. Okay, so Arizona had a ways to go, but I think it's getting to be dangerous out there. I think what happened is that people were kind of lulled by the high temperatures, okay, in Arizona, and also by the lack of cases reported, okay, in Arizona. And I don't think people in Arizona have done much when it comes to face masking or social distancing. And so I think that now COVID has come to Arizona. It's starting to rise very, very fast. Joanne says it's 88 and smoky in Tucson. There are wildfires. Oh, no. Matt says, any thoughts about the best way to break the power of the duopoly? Do you think a third party is feasible? If you're talking about a third party that would be successful in the election this year, successful in terms of electing someone to the presidency, no, I don't see yet, okay, that it's possible. There's not the level of revulsion against the two parties. In other words, there's a level of revulsion and hatred for the two parties that is very, very high. But to make a third party feasible in a run for the presidency, or even in runs for the Congress, okay, in various places, coming from a base which is maybe 1% or 2% or even less, there has to develop a general determination, okay, among the populace that it will, under no circumstances, vote for any of the candidates of the morally bankrupt two-party duopoly. If such a feeling were to spread among the American people, we would become very aware of it from the polling, because suddenly we'd have a huge number of undecideds in the polling, and nobody would be saying that they would be voting for candidates of a duopoly. And that's not the polling we're getting. And the third parties, without that kind of polling, the third parties don't have any power to break through with their message. I mean, how can they get through? But they don't have enough power on social media. And of course, the mainstream will not cover any of them to any great extent. So nobody even knows the names of the candidates of the third parties. I mean, just such a low percentage of people. They would have to have candidates who were running who were just so charismatic that they simply carried people away along with them. I think that in time for this election, the upcoming election, I don't think that's possible. Now, what is possible is that you could have the beginning of such a revulsion of the duopoly that a third party might be able to get maybe 5% of the vote, okay, in the upcoming election or something like that. Something large enough to give them a foothold that they could build on for 2022 and 2024. But in recent years, no third party has been able to do that. In part because the two major parties locked up the electoral system, putting so many electoral barriers in the way of third parties that it's been impossible for them even to build a plurality of 5%, okay, in major presidential elections. Now, if we're going to do this, it's got to start somewhere. We've got to have enough people in the third party movement that they are willing just to vote for the third party to get it strong enough that it can be a factor in upcoming elections in 2022 and 2024. I don't think that's entirely impossible. I think one scenario under which it might be able to occur is, okay, let's say the way it looks now, that Trump is looking so badly, people hate Trump so much that they go over to whoever the Democratic candidate is. I'm assuming, of course, like everybody else, that Joe Biden is going to remain healthy for another 2 months or so, and that he'll come out as the nominee, okay, in the Democratic Party. If that happens, if he doesn't have a ruinous cognitive decay within the next 2 months, or a sudden event that takes him out, okay, in the next 2 months, then it would most probably have to be based on people feeling just such a general hatred and disapproval for Trump that Joe Biden really develops an enormous lead in the election. That would be the best situation for a third-party candidate. Because if Joe Biden was suddenly ahead across the board in all the polls, from whatever source, of let's say 25% over Donald Trump, then people who want to build that third party would feel safe in voting for that third party in the general. Because even if they took 5 or 10% away from Joe Biden, he would still handily win the election. Trump would be thrown out. But the Republicans would be thrown out. But that third party would finally establish a beachhead. That's probably the kind of scenario that would work for a third party. But if that election gets at all close, and for people who are afraid of another presidency of Trump, in other words, we have to recognize this is not like 2016 or 2017, or even 2018, it's now apparent that Trump uh, is beginning to make very tentative moves to consolidate a dictatorship in the country. If that continues to happen as we move towards the election in the fall, I don't see people being willing to take a chance on voting for a third party if the polls are showing an election which is anywhere near close. It would have to be looking like a runaway for Biden for third parties to be able to amass a vote in that particular situation. Joanne says, is the Tucson mayor is delaying by reopening? Probably a smart idea. Conservatives are not happy, and true, not enough people are wearing masks. We are until hospitals allow visitors. Steve says, that's why I wanted Jesse Ventura to run. Yeah, me too. Matt says, do you predict a higher turnout in November? The last election, 100 million did not vote. I don't predict a high turnout unless, again, it looks like, okay, it's going to be close. But of course, as you know, Biden is now starting to build a substantial lead. In the CNN recent poll, it was a 14-point lead. Now let's take the scenario where we have COVID coming back, where we have a second wave of COVID coming back. The R noughts start to turn around, and they're over 1, okay, in many states. Okay, let's say about a month from now that we have an economy which is continuing to tank. And we have a Republican Party too stubborn to do anything for people, so it continues to tank, and it tanks through August. It tanks through September. More and more people are out of work. More and more people have gone to foreclosure. More and more people have lost their rental housing because they cannot pay their rents. And generally, we just have a huge depression with the Republicans and Democrats paralyzed, not being able to do anything. Okay. Most of the blame for that is going to be placed at Trump's doorstep. So let's say in that scenario, Biden, without really doing anything, rides to a 25-point lead along around September, October. And the lead looks very, very solid as we approach Election Day. Then, in that situation, I think people would be willing to take a chance and vote on the third party. Okay. But you asked me, do I predict a higher turnout? With that kind of lead, okay, in November, the vote for Trump may turn out to be much lower than we expect, because his people might at that point just get really, really, really discouraged and not turn out for the polls. And a lot of Democratic voters might also decide to stay home. If people think it's already decided, there may not be a higher turnout. If the election looks like it's close, we may have a higher turnout. If, as I say, we have the scenario where people are still hating Donald Trump. So Matt asked me, Joe, how do you come to the conclusion that Trump is moving towards a dictatorship? Well, the moves, his tweeting about trying to militarize the response to peaceful protesters and trying to have the military come into D.C. Uh, without identifiers and to begin to patrol the streets, of D.C. The move to expand the grounds of the White House, the perimeter, of the White House, to enclose parts, of D.C. I mean, that stuff is all unconstitutional stuff. It's not within the power of the president. That's the president demanding more authority and more power than the president has under the Constitution. That's a move towards establishing a dictatorship supported by the armed forces. And some of those armed forces in D.C., there's just a possibility that they were a private army, that they weren't even the U.S. Army. We don't know that they were. They were unidentified. They could have been Eric Prince. I mean, they could have been she mercenaries. We don't know at this point. Congress is going to investigate who gave the authorization for those troops, who gave the orders, and where do they come from. We do not know at this point that those orders went through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If not, that's a move towards a dictatorship. If Trump were to get away with that, he would apply it in other situations as well, in other cities, not just in D.C. They were using Predator drones in Minnesota and in other cities across the United States in order to monitor the protests. Again, peaceful protests. It's one thing to talk about the brutality of the local police. That raises very, very serious issues. But that's still not federal brutality. And that's still not turning over the cities to the military. Okay. There's no insurrection here that justifies any kind of declaration, of martial law for the United States. The mayors of the cities, on the contrary, are declaring that they can handle the situation. And in many cities, they've been de-escalating, and they've been successful. If Trump continues down that road, that will be moving further towards a dictatorship. Evelina says, I can see a coalition party further down the road drawing from the already weakened parties that exist. I can see that happening too, but a third party has to establish a base in some election, somewhere. It has to establish that it has the loyalty of a decent percentage of the voting population, even if it's only 5%, okay, to start with. And it has to be able to get, I think, at least a few congressional seats and a lot more local elections in which third parties are successful. Then there's a potential for coalition parties. If that were to happen, then there might be a potential for certain people unhappy in the Republican Party, unhappy inside of the Democratic Party, to leave those two parties and to join the coalition party. Evelina says, question is, will you or I still be breathing? I can't make a prediction about that. Thus far, knock on wood, I seem to be as healthy as I was last year and the year before and the year before that, so it's all good. And Jay Elias says, hi, Joe. Hi, Jay. And Matt says, have faith, we will survive. What I think, Matt, is that we need to have faith and keep our powder dry, if you know what I mean. And Jay says, everything Trump has said sounds like other dictators. Well, I don't know if it sounds like all other dictators, but it sounds like Mussolini to me, that specific dictator. And it sounds like he was taking plays out of Mussolini's playbook and some out of Hitler's playbook as well. But I liken Trump far more to Mussolini, okay, than to Hitler. Rashid Mohammed says, why are they allowing Trump free reign? Think you have to ask that question of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, because they, more than any other two people, have been allowing Trump to get away with bloody murder. They needed to become intransigent and try to block Trump and the Republicans at every turn. They needed to be totally uncooperative, totally hostile, and totally insistent on their own way of doing things, and ready to destroy the whole system if they didn't get their way. Matt says, Joe, great job giving substantive and thoughtful answers to such an array of questions. Much appreciated. Well, thank you, Matt. I try to be thoughtful. Tom Hartman was saying he's afraid of the GOP taking the election away if it is close in November. I agree with Tom. That's always something to be feared. After all, they took away the election of 2000 that way. They took away the election of 2004. They didn't get away with it in 2008. It was too big to make up the deficit that they had. I think that Obama's actual margin was probably bigger than 53 to 47. I'm not sure they managed to take away the election of 2016. That is, I think they monkeyed around with the vote, okay, in various ways, okay, during that particular election. But I think what really won it for Trump was Hillary's failure just to do basic things, just the stubbornness. Like, why not declare early on when she first started to run that she was not for the TPP instead of waiting till so late in the game? She should have started echoing Bernie Sanders from the first that she was not for the TPP. She should have known that was going to give her grave problems in the Midwest. She had to swear off it early, whatever Obama thought. She could have explained to him in private, look, I have to win this election. I'm not going to keep the Midwestern states if I say I'm for these trade deals. I can't do it. I'm sorry, Barack. This is the parting of the ways when it comes to the trade deals. She needed to say that to him. And when it came to Medicare for all, she also needed to say, the Affordable Care Act has not worked as we hoped it would, in part because of the opposition of the Republicans, and the opposition of state governors, in many, many states, and the failures to extend it. Still, 30 million people are uncovered by the Affordable Care Act. We now see the Affordable Care Act was weak, structurally did not work as we hoped. Therefore, I am now for Medicare for all. We know that will work. We know the heavy majority of the country is for it. I am for it. If I'm elected, I'm going to pass Medicare for all. If she had done those two things, she would have been elected going away. She was too stubborn, too arrogant, and too stupid to do those things. There's an old saying. It dates from the accession of Henry IV to the throne of France. Henry IV was he was a Protestant. He was a Huguenot, a French Protestant, at the time. He'd grown up that way. When they came to him and offered him the throne, but insisted that he convert to Catholicism, he reportedly said, Paris is worth a mass. If Henry IV could say that Paris is worth a mass and convert to Catholicism in order to get Paris, then Hillary Clinton could have converted to fair trade and to Medicare for all to get Washington, the D.C. But she didn't. Matt says, I think election integrity is always an issue in the U.S. Says, true, Matthew, but this could be worth. Sandy says, shared. Jay says, seems like Democrats want Trump to win again. Sandy says, thank you, Dolores Pierce, for comments and likes on the shares. Thank you both for sharing and for being so supportive. And Joanne says, shared. And Dolores says, you are very welcome. Joanne says, Hitler spawn. I guess that was meant for Trump. Sandy says, thank you, Joanne. And Rashid Mohammed says, Schumer and Nancy Pelosi need to be voted out. Absolutely, they do. But I think Schumer has a strong grip. Stronger grip, maybe, than Nancy has. It's going to be hard to find a challenger to Chuck Schumer. There might be a challenger who could win against Chuck, okay, in New York State, but it might be necessary for Bernie Sanders to move back to New York State and to run for the Senate there. Sorry, but that's never going to happen. I think he likes living in Vermont too much. Jay says Democrats are complicit enablers because they also profit from his policies. Well, yeah. Yeah, they're all millionaires now, and they all profited from his policies. Kay says, my daughter messaged me from work to wish me happy birthday earlier, and of course we ended up talking politics. Laugh out loud. She's a chip off the old mom block. Laugh out loud. Evelina says, election integrity has been an issue in the U.S. The nerve to point fingers at other countries. I know. Isn't it incredible? Of course, they have the nerve if they can get away with it. They've been getting away with it now for so many years. For so many years, you begin to think you can always get away with it. But I think now, in the face of what Trump has been doing here in the U.S., it's just been going too far. Happy birthday, Kay. Happy birthday, Kay, says Steve and Sandy. And I say it too, Kay. Happy birthday. May your future years be very good ones. Maybe Biden will surprise us all and make Bernie the vice president. And then maybe Bernie will gradually take over the presidency as Biden, like that old soldier, fades away. And Rashid Mohammed says, not true burners are occupying the Democratic Party to get reform in the Democratic Party. Not true burners are occupying get reform. Bernie delegate here, I see it happening. What, you see the Bernie delegates trying to get reform of the Democratic Party? Or the Bernie delegates failing to get reform of the Democratic Party? And Joanne puts a whole bunch of birthday symbols up there for Kay. Kay says, thank you, Steve and Sandy. Clea says, establishment Dems. Sorry, I scrolled down too much. Establishment Dems can't be for Medicare for all because they want insurance company dollars. Many establishment Dems want, insurance company dollars. But, those dollars, for many of them, are not so much. The big insurance company dollars go to, I don't know, maybe 10 of the Democrats in the House, and maybe 4 or 5 of the Democrats, in the Senate. I think many Democrats can afford to give up the insurance company dollars. They get, like, for example, a few days ago, there was an article about how much money candidates were getting from the police unions, people in the Republican Party, and people from the Democratic Party. It wasn't actually huge sums. Amy Klobuchar got, since, 2004 or something, 2005 or something like that. I think she got something like $12,000 from then until now. It takes, to get a Senate seat, in Minnesota, you have to be funded like maybe $20 million, $30 million, something like that. It's big money. If the police unions were giving her what, 2, 3, 5,000 for one of those senatorial campaigns, I mean, realistically speaking, I don't think that's enough to buy her vote. Now, it may be that she was always sympathetic to them and generally agreed, okay, with their positioning, and so she was happy to get maybe 5,000 in one election, 10,000, okay, in another. But I don't think small amounts like that are enough to buy a candidate for the Senate, and not even a candidate for the House. Like in AOC's case, first time she ran, she had $300,000. Now, maybe a 10,000 contribution, if she had been willing to take any corporate money, maybe a $10,000 contribution would have been influential in that sort of situation. But this time around, she's raised more than $1 million from people. I'm sure it's much more than $1 million for her campaign. I think she passed $1 million a long, long time ago, and now she's helping to collect money for other candidates. She has more than enough to get her message out there and to be reelected this fall, even with some primary challenges. And I think she knows that. Now, if she had taken any corporate money, which I still think she hadn't, but she had gotten, let's say, $5,000 from the police union, okay, in New York, would that $5,000 have been enough to buy her vote? $5,000 out of $1 million? Out of $1 million? I mean, if I were in that kind of a position and I had that kind of contributor, and that kind of contributor wanted me to change my mind about something, let's say I were the type of person who was willing to change my vote in return for a contribution, I don't think 5,000 would be enough to move me. I don't think I'd take a second look at a $5,000 contribution from a rich person, okay, or from a union or something like that. I'd say, oh, it's nice they support me. But if they ask for special favors of consequence, if they're a big contributor, okay, I might agree to a meeting. I might listen or something like that, but change my vote if I had an established opinion about something? No way. Russ says Schumer has a grip until AOC runs. Yeah, but you know something? I don't know whether AOC will be able to get upstate support against Schumer. It won't be an easy race, okay, for AOC. If Schumer retires, she might have, okay, a pretty good chance. But remember, you have to win a lot of upstate votes in order to become a senator, okay, New York State. Now, Bernie, who comes from the city, can talk to rural voters because he's always been able to get a lot of them in Vermont over the years. He's learned how to talk to small town voters, okay, and to rural voters. I don't think AOC has that experience. I mean, I know we love her. And we do, and we think she'd be wonderful for New York State. But it's not going to be easy for her to court typical voters in Syracuse, in Rochester, okay, in Buffalo, okay, in Albany. Okay. I mean, maybe she'll do well in Ithaca, New York. Well, Cornell is there. Has a big influence, Kate, on the local surroundings. But it's been hard for progressive candidates to win up there. It's been hard. And Deborah Wilson says, sorry, I blinked out. I had shit going on. Okay. Russ says, I need to turn in. See you again soon. Thanks for coming, Russell. Happy birthday, Kay, says Lana. Sandy says, can't Bernie just buy a condo in New York City, okay, and run? Probably the condos in New York City are too expensive for Bernie. I mean, Bernie is not so rich that he can afford a condo, okay, in New York City. Now, he's got a few million now. But a condo in New York City, in Midtown or something like that, that would probably take his whole $3 million stash. No, I think Bernie is in Vermont for the duration. He's got a whole family up there. Everybody knows him. Everybody loves him. He's not leaving there. Kay says, thank you, Lana. Kay says, thank you, Joe. And Evelyn says, hey, Kay. Rob says, hey, Yoda. Hey, Rob. How are you? I scrolled too fast again, so let me get back. And Kay commented and said, thank you, Dolores and Evelina. And Sandy says, Biden should pick Bernie if he had half a brain. Yeah. Yeah, if he wants to have a chance at getting us to vote for him, he needs to pick Bernie. I mean, nobody that we talk with or we interact with are going to get excited if he picks Harris or if he picks Val Demings or if he picks Stacey Abrams and Klobuchar. Forget about it. Forget about it. I'd say with all the others, it's also forget about it. But we don't know how Val Demings would come out with a larger audience than she's had. In other words, she's had really very little exposure, so we don't know how she plays. In other words, we don't have the charisma factor on her actually pinned down yet. So we might find that she's really a person, who resonates with us. Also, the mayor of Atlanta has been getting some press lately because she had a few good interviews. And she does seem like a powerful personality. So, who knows? But it's unlikely that we're going to get excited over anybody except for Bernie. We're certainly not going to get excited over Warren because we do not trust her. Now, we already have a problem because we don't trust Joe Biden. So if he picks someone else we don't trust, like Kamala or Amy or Warren, I know they're the heads of some of the progressive interest groups who love Warren. Like, for example, Adam Green and Stephanie Taylor of the is it the PCCC? Anyway, they love Warren. They picked her at first and supported her, throughout the campaign. So they love her. And so, from their point of view, the progressives love her. But after the way she behaved during the primaries, doing much to cost the nomination for Bernie, I don't think there are very many of us in the grassroots, okay, the movement, okay, about the progressive movement, who would be excited over them picking Warren as the VP nomination. So I don't think she gets Joe Biden the votes, okay, of the progressives. I don't think she does. He needs someone who does. I think he'd be much better off with Tulsi if he's looking for somebody who can get at least some of the progressives somewhat excited. But really, the only one who can get us excited, maybe somewhat excited, is Bernie Sanders. And Jim Bird says Biden will not get the nod to pick Senator Bernie. He doesn't have to have a nod. He can just do it himself. And Rashid says, Sandy Degg, that's the problem. Dementia is killing his brain. Clea Markman says, you have to include industry super PACs. A single company is limited to the amount they can donate, but a super PAC, okay, it's unlimited. Yes, I agree. Super PAC is unlimited. Rashid says, I could listen to you on and on. Very informative. Thank you, Rashid. Judith says, can you provide a link to the article you referenced about campaign donations, Amy Klobuchar, okay, and others? Yeah, I will look it up again. It's got to be somewhere in my history after the show. I will hunt down a link for you, Judith. And I will leave it in the comments for you, either in the comments, okay, or in the description. I'll probably need about an hour, though, because the first thing I have to do is post this up to YouTube after I end. Kay says, laugh out loud. And that's because you have integrity, Joe. I don't know about that. I'm just, well, I suppose it's because of that, but okay. It's also because if I came to an opinion myself about what the right thing to do was, okay, in a particular situation, okay, and I needed money to win a campaign, and I needed about $1 million, okay, to win a campaign, okay, and somebody came to me with a contribution of $5,000 and asked me to change my vote, I wouldn't even give them a second thought. Just because I had already worked out, okay, an answer that I thought, okay, was the best answer. Joanne says, that NGOs are not to be trusted or contributed to. I think you're talking super PACs now, Joanne, right? I don't think super PACs are NGOs. I think NGOs are non-governmental organizations. That's the general term for them. Rob says, hey, Yoda, how are you? I'm great. Thank you, Rob. How are you? And Jay Lai says phone battery is about to die. Thanks, Joe. Cheers. And Kay says Bernie would hate New York City. Probably, yes. At this stage of his life, he would probably hate New York City. He would hate what New York City has become. Says the only proper place for him in New York City would probably be to move into Ocasio-Cortez's district or move into a Brooklyn district that still had some real people in it. Rob says, so you think Biden can still lose? I see him losing the black vote, especially after Biden saying he's not in favor of defunding the police. In fact, he said he is in favor of increasing police funding. Well, I don't think he's going to lose the black vote but relative to Trump, I don't think so. Sandy says, I still think Biden will. Yeah, I think Biden can still lose. Yeah, I mean, there are scenarios under which he could lose. We don't know that there's going to be a second wave of COVID yet. But if there's a second wave of COVID, there's a second wave of blame coming for Trump because the reopenings are certainly premature from a pure COVID health standpoint. And he's been leading the charge to reopen. So he's going to be blamed again. And I'm telling you, from my own personal point of view, that man's mishandling of the COVID situation has killed more than 100,000 people in the United States already. And a large proportion of them are blacks. That's not counting his attitudes towards blacks and his creating a climate which has certainly exacerbated the problems of how blacks are treated by the police. That is compared to the other possibility. In other words, if some other president, possibly over the period of time, beginning to treat the problem and to moderate it somewhat. But yes, if the second wave does not come, if the economy starts to work out for Trump, so let's say the unemployment rates are down around 6% or 7% by, let's say, the end of October, and a fair number of people are back, okay, and working. Maybe the Republicans have combined with Democrats to do a little more for people by then, and they see the economy continuing to get better, and Biden is offering nothing and is exhibiting very obvious cognitive decline, even more than he is now. Biden can still blow it. Sandy says, choose Michelle. Oh, God. I can't stand her. I can't stand her because I know she's a neoliberal shit. That's why I can't stand her. I mean, from what I've seen, I like her as a person. I don't have any problems with her that way. But I just have ideological problems with her. Don't want another neoliberal shit in the presidency. Kay says, I don't think the Atlanta mayor is interested in Biden's VP slot. Yeah, maybe not. She has kids. She wants to bring them up. Clea says, yeah, Nina Turner's exciting. Yeah, Nina's exciting, but there's no way Joe Biden is going to turn to Nina Turner. And Sam says, yo, really sorry I've been so absent. All technical difficulties plus burnout. Sorry to hear it, Sam. I hope technical difficulties are over and that you're feeling better. And Sandy says, Warren. And Rob says, Biden offered $300 million for police to get to know the people they're going to be abusing. He said not $300 million for police to get to know the people they're going to be abusing. Is he crazy? He said nothing about massive increases in social programs. This is terrible. Many Democrats think 2020 has Joe become a slam dunk, but I see otherwise. If they can't capture a significant amount of the young vote, and if he loses the same, if not more, than when Hillary lost among blacks voting bloc, Biden will lose and will lose worse than Hillary. Biden is going to have a tough time in the Midwest. Well, I think there's much to that, Rob, but it depends upon whether we see further attrition in the employment rate. If we get the economy continuing to tank, and I think it still is in the process of tanking, I think we just don't see it because people have been propped up for a short time, and until the end of July, they'll have some money to stave off some of the worst of it. But there are starting to be evictions. There's the mortgage foreclosure rounds are now starting up. People having trouble paying their student loans, of course. If these things start to mount up through the rest of this month and then through July, we will be moving into August with just a huge lead for Joe Biden all over the country. Because of the COVID and the economic impacts of what's happening with COVID are in the end going to fall on Trump. There's no way Biden can be tagged with that, even though we here know that he might have done just as badly on the economic end, though he probably would have done better in managing the COVID end, because he would have turned it over to Ron Klain, who helped him, who helped on Obama with the Ebola crisis. But Ron Klain is Biden's friend, and he knew Biden from that situation. He would immediately have been appointed by Biden, if Biden were president, let's say, to handle COVID, and Klain would have been very energetic about it. He wouldn't have missed a trick. Would not have missed a trick. And we would have nipped that on bud. And remember, we could have gotten deaths in this country if it had been managed properly in the range of 1 per million, 3 per million, 5 per million, I mean, maybe 10 per million. Most of those 100,000 deaths could have been avoided. It was in countries that followed proper procedure. Countries with substantial populations, not 330 million people, but countries with 51 million people, 24 million people, and 30 million people, but 4 million people. Those countries had fatalities as a percentage of population in that kind of range. As a country, we had the technical capability to do that. We just did not react with all our capability strongly enough and rapidly enough to do that. And more than anybody else, that was Trump's fault. That's at his doorstep. Sam says picking Tulsi would pull in some of the progressives and libertarians both. They would really like Tulsi. Yes, they do. And during the campaign, she never had enough money to really get her message out, okay, and to get going. And Kay says, I never thought Biden had a slam dunk. Still doesn't. I don't think he has either. A slam dunk. That's big lead, but he doesn't have a slam dunk. And he doesn't have a slam dunk because he doesn't know how to take advantage of a big lead. He's another one. If he said right now, I'm persuaded by Bernie. I've been talking to Bernie in the last few days. I'm persuaded by Bernie that the only way to go is Medicare for all. And the only way to go is a Green New Deal, and that it's going to take $16 trillion to do that right. And I'm going to do that right. If he did those two things, and he said, I've also been talking to Bernie, and I'm off the free trade kick. I'm not going to support anything like the TPP or anything like that anymore. I'm going to go for fair trade treaties. From now on, that's going to be the order of the day. And we're going to work as hard as we can to stop the foreign wars. If he said those things, he would have a slam dunk. Trump would never, never win. He doesn't want a slam dunk. He wants to be stubborn. He wants to be arrogant. He wants to be foolish. He wants to talk to the people he's talked to for years and not to other people. And Deborah says, you do great work on here, Joe. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much. And Sam says, yeah, the polls are not really a clear indication. We knew that last time, and they haven't gotten much better. That's true. I think the polls still are loaded. I think they're loaded in various ways. Right now, they're probably loaded against Trump. They certainly were loaded against Bernie during the campaign. Kay says polls can no longer be trusted. Rashid said, protested, cured COVID. I laughed my ass off. And Rashid says, protesters, not protested. Joanne says, got to go now. I'll finish watching later. Thanks for coming, Joanne. Sam says, no, they cannot. Most polls are propaganda. They read how they want to read. They know how to do real scientific polls. They choose not to. Yes. I say we because I'm a social scientist with that kind of training. We do know how to do real scientific polls. But we choose not to. Why? because we're not paid to do real scientific polls. Then I shouldn't say we, because I haven't been in the polling business. I was never in the polling business. I got a graduate training in how to poll. So I know all about how to poll and, scales and how to do all that stuff. I know they're not doing that. Why? Because their customers don't want that. Joanne says, don't listen to polls. Kay says, exactly, Sam Hollenbeck. And Judy Ryan says, no, Michelle. I'm sorry, Judy Van Ryzen. Van Ryzen's got to be how you pronounce that. Rob says, who knows? I could be wrong. If you look at the polls, people being polled contradict themselves all the time. Yeah, that's right. It really is an unknown. This is scary. I truly wish Biden would pick Bernie, but he won't. I know. Why? Because he stupidly promised that he was going to pick a woman. Why did he promise that? Why did he promise that? Did it help him get any votes in the primary? I seriously doubt that. I seriously doubt that. He had those votes all wrapped up. Sandy says, Michelle is a shit. Evelina says, depressing to talk about, but two of the cops that were with Chauvin have Asian names. Bakiang and Tao, what's that? I think Tao is Thai. I'm not sure about Bakiang, though. I'm not sure that's an Asian name. I think it could possibly be Finnish. In the north of Minnesota, in Michigan, there are people of Finnish extraction. And from the pictures I've seen, I think the only one of the four who was an Oriental, who was of Oriental extraction, was Tao. I'm not sure his last name is actually Tao, but I had the impression that he was Thai. Steve asks, H-Mon? Yeah, it might have been that. I have to look up the names again. Rob says, why don't you think the mayor of Atlanta is not interested in the VP? Excuse my ignorance, but I have no idea who the mayor of Atlanta is. The mayor of Atlanta comes over as a very bright and very attractive lady who is a mother, still bringing up 4 children in Atlanta that she is very concerned about and very involved with. She made a number of very good and apparently very sincere statements in response to disorders in her city. And she handled things in a very intelligent way, de-escalating things that had gotten kind of ugly over a period of time. And she's been getting a great deal of media attention. Before that, she's an extremely attractive lady. Besides, she makes a very good presence. She speaks extremely well. I'd say that she's eloquent. On the surface, she looks like she'd be a very good candidate. Steve Volkbrand. Keong, and maybe Tao. Yeah, I think it was Tao, Thao, not Tao. I had the impression that that was a Thai name. I'm not sure where I got that from, but I did spend a little time in Thailand back in 1969, so I got to know some Thai names, so maybe that just sounds like a Thai name based on that experience. Kay says, I think they're skewing the polls tight now to screw with Trump. He always loses it. That's true. Steve Wolfbrandt, Keong, and maybe Tao, not Tao, says Evelina. Rob says, you're absolutely right about the economic conditions will make any incumbent president lose. This economy is really bad. And getting worse, not getting better. In other words, the recent results had to do with a temporary improvement in the picture due to the fact that the PPP program was beginning to work and lowering the formal unemployment statistics as a result. But the impact of the PPP, without further reinforcement, with further relief bills, that's going to end in July sometime. And when that ends, things are going to tank. And not only that, Rob, but they haven't made any moves to give money to state and local governments. And millions more are about to get kicked out of jobs at the state and local government level because the states don't have any tax money coming in due to the depression. So the economy is set to tank in July again and to begin to tank further this month. So that's why I think it's going to get worse, and it's going to be placed at Trump's door and the Republicans' door. Okay, because the Democrats are going to blame them with justification for not voting for the relief. Okay, now Nancy Pelosi would be in a still better shape to place the blame on them if she had come out for the Tlaib and Jayapal bill and for Jayapal's paycheck guarantee bill. If she had come out for those two things and for Medicare for all on a temporary basis and saddled Mitch with that, oh yeah, that would have made it much tougher for Mitch and for Trump. But Pelosi never does that. She makes it easier for them. Kay says, Rob, she's a younger, a black woman, but I can't remember her name. I can't remember her name right now either. Sam Hallenbach said, does he? I often wonder how much of the constant reports of his tantrums are exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Now, good point. But I think some of it is based on fact that he does tend to throw tantrums very frequently. But Sam, you're right. Sam says, I might be wrong, but the media exaggerates everything with Trump. Yes, they do. Evelina says, I don't think they're Chinese names, though. And Kay says, just my opinion, Sam, but I think so. Yes. Yes, Judith, I know that it's Dutch. I recognized the van, which is distinctively Dutch. Kay says, just my opinion, Sam, but I think so. Sandy says, Trump's campaign commercial was a joke. Rob says, Sam Hollenbeck don't feel more than like many are feeling, just as burned out as you. Take care of yourself. Kay says, wish it would cool off. I'll never be able to sleep tonight. Steve says, same here, Kay. Is it too hot in Los Angeles, Steve? Rashid says, and the only paying 70% and replace with Medicare for all to pay 100% claims. Absolutely. And Judith says, I sure hope Biden's handlers are listening and take you seriously. And Judith Van Ryzen said, you said it perfectly. It's Dutch. So he said, Biden said he would pick a woman because Bernie said he was going to pick a woman. Copycat. Yeah, but Bernie had some good women to pick from. And Biden doesn't. And Judith says that Tao is Hmong. And Steve said, I think so as well. I think that's probably true. Lana says we have a huge Hmong population here in Minnesota. Okay, and that also Laos and Vietnamese as well. And Rashid says, do you think Bernie will unsuspend his campaign? No. I don't think he's going to unsuspend his campaign unless Joe Biden cannot continue. Then he might unsuspend his campaign. Judith says Laotians. Yeah, could be. Judith says not Thai. Thai names are very different from Hmong. Okay, you sound like you have more experience than I, okay, in this area. Okay, I've only been to Thailand once, and I've never been to Laos, Cambodia, okay, or Vietnam. In the case that Biden has to drop out, Biden has secured the delegates from what I saw. Well, he may have secured them, but if he drops out, I think they'll be free to turn to somebody else. Now, of course, it may depend on who Biden endorses, but Biden might surprise everyone and endorse Bernie. Kay says, I wish, Rashid. Lana says, Steve. We mentioned Michelle, isn't she a man? Steve says, I'm not taking the bait. Okay, and Judith Van Ryzen says, she's a neoliberal Pelosi. She's not going to give the American worker anything. I know, she is. Steve says, very hot in Los Angeles. Yeah, Divorce says she likes the heat there. She likes it when it's 90 degrees. Kay says, very hot in Northeast Ohio, too. And laugh out loud. Kay says, but Jeff and I are looking into AC, but I haven't been able to find any locally sold out. Well, they're sold out, okay, of air conditioners, or they're sold out at the movies that have the air conditioning. When I was a kid, okay, and it got hot, okay, in our apartment, okay, in New York, we did not have any air conditioning either. So when it got real hot, we would try to spend as much time as we could at the local movie house, which had air conditioning. This was in the Pelham Parkway section of the Bronx, which is now in Ocasio-Cortez's district, by the way. Okay, everybody. I've gone through all your comments. Okay, it's 11:17, 11:19. I've been on for 2 hours and 19 minutes. And Judith says it's pronounced as Mong. The H tells you to blow air out your nose as you say Mong. Mong. Okay, thank you, Judith. I like that better. Mong. As a matter of fact, if I blow air out my nose, when saying Mong, it's easier for me to say Mong. Yes, it is. Does anyone know anything about that portable AC I keep seeing ads for? Sandy says, drive-in movies are making a comeback. No AC. Kay says, AC in the car, though. Judith says, you can stand any more linguistics. The word Mong is also said with a high-pitched tone, as in Mong. I don't know if that's a high enough pitched tone. I don't know if I can do that, Judith. But thank you for the tip. Lana says good night. Good night, Lana. Good night, everybody. Sandy says, our AC window does our entire house, but my house is small. Evelyn says, thank you for that mini language lesson, Judith. I love languages. Okay, and Lana says, I love the drive-in. I never got completely adopted to drive-ins because, as I said, I grew up, in New York. So I never even got to a drive-in, until I was in college. And also for college, I didn't even have a car. So if I would go to a drive-in, I had to go as part of a double date with somebody else. So Lana said she's a language nerd too. Sandy said, good night, Joe and Bonnie and everyone. Kay says, night, all. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Kay, and good night to you. And Judith said, YW and good night, dear Joe. Thank you, Judith. And Sandy says, I like driving. We had one in town. Evelina sends a heart to all of us. And Dolores says, thank you and good night, all, and also sends a heart. Thank you very much for coming. I'll see you tomorrow night. Take care.